Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our latest session in Net Zero Week as part of our Places Day for the week. And this session is on reimagining urban landscapes from grey spaces to green places. And I know that this is going to be a very interesting discussion with four knowledgeable experts in their fields, and we're going to be exploring how do we actually reimagine those urban landscapes, and how do we do so in a way that promotes sustainability and that helps us towards that net zero goal. Panelists this morning, by the way, my name's Andy Walker. I'm a construction journalist and also a contributor to Climate Perspectives magazine, and you'll see a link for Climate Perspectives magazine in the chat. Also, just to point out as well, while we're talking about buttons and technology, if you've got any questions for any of our panelists, please post them in the questions box, which you'll be able to find because it's got like a sort of a quote box with a question mark in it. The exact location of which on your device will depend on the device that you're using. So I won't try and second guess that, but you'll see it on the screen in front of you anyway. Anyway, our panel today, we've got Andrew Gladstone-Heighton from ACE. ACE is the Association for Consultancy and Engineering, and he's actually going to present their report, Grey Spaces to Green Places, which we actually kindly swiped and put into the title of the session. We've also got Tim Bevan from Building with Nature, who's going to discuss integrating green infrastructure to address ecological and climate emergencies and other issues besides that. We've also got Josh Matthews as well, who's going to be talking to us about a range of issues. Josh is an independent activist, analyst, and founder of CMAS, Critical Mass for Sustainability, and he's going to make the objective and emotive case for sustainability. And we've also got Robin Tucker, who is co-chair of the Oxford-based Coalition for Healthy Streets and Active Travel. I'll try and pronounce the acronym COSAT, it looks like to me. So that's what I've just said. And Robin's going to be the first speaker in the panel. Robin's also a trustee of two charities, Cycling UK and Earth Trust. His career started in the business sector at Oliver Wyman Consulting in transport, telecoms, and a range of other sectors. He then moved to Vodafone, and then he moved to Natural England, which it says here reignited his environmental interests. On leaving Natural England in 2010, he founded his own management consulting firm and started promoting business sustainability and started campaigning for active travel in 2015. So I'm very fascinated to hear from someone with such a varied career and some key interests there, very germane and relevant to the discussion that we're talking about today. Robin, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Andy, and good morning from Oxford. I'm going to tell you the story of what's been happening on the streets here and why it's important for the whole net zero transition. And it starts, maybe oddly, in World War II, when Hitler didn't bomb Oxford because he wanted to live here. This left us with our narrow medieval streets, and we've had traffic problems ever since, and multiple attempts to tackle them. Britain's first park and ride in 1973, bus gates in 1999, and the latest plan, emerging in 2015, is for 6 strategic traffic filters to cut traffic and emissions. Then along came COVID, and this was delayed, but there was government money for low traffic neighbourhoods, or LTNs. These addressed problems of danger and pollution at really appalling levels in some residential areas. Now it gets interesting because a protest movement developed. Some people living outside the LTNs were inconvenienced by them. They lost cut-throughs and driving was limited to main roads, which were congested. Some of them started pulling out bollards, cutting them down and making threats against councillors. It got quite nasty. As key decisions on the traffic filters came, things got a bit surreal. Local protesters joined up with conspiracy theorists. People that promoted anti-vax and climate change denial said that the traffic filters would imprison people in their 15-minute neighbourhoods, misusing a town planning term that just means having shops in easy walking distance. They said that the people of Oxford would be guinea pigs in climate lockdowns where citizens will be restricted to reduce emissions. In February 2023, they organised a protest march in Oxford. Groups came from across the country and beyond, about 2,000 in all. There were right-wingers, conspiracy theorists, football hooligans, druids and locals. Ironically, they met in Broad Street in the centre, which was made safe by traffic filters and bollards. It's easy to laugh, but the point is this. Of the interventions required to reach net zero, about 2/3 require some form of behaviour change. Most people don't find this easy, and in some cases it's downright hard. We should expect protest. We should expect Just Stop Green. So what to do? Let's remember that most people end up liking these changes. They like clean air and safe streets. No LTN that has been in place for 2 years has been taken out. In Ghent, Belgium, their traffic plan remains. Our most fervent anti-LTN councillor lives in a new build LTN, and that points to 2 ways forward for net zero policies, I think. One is to carefully build engagement and consensus, always knowing that you will have 10% strongly against. And the other is to bang them in with confidence and hold on until they become the new normal. I'm looking forward to the question session. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Robin. And I think it's really good that you've majored there on the whole behaviour change agenda as well, and also touched on some of the politics of all of this, because actually the previous session, which was an absolutely fantastic session, I was trying to get to grips with some of the politics, but I'd representatives from the local authority sector, and obviously that's quite challenging because obviously they're limited on what they can say. And I sense that we could have quite an interesting conversation here in relation to the whole politics of persuasion as well, which I think is a very interesting area and a fascinating one for someone like me who writes about this stuff, both in terms of the people who are affected and also the politicians themselves. So absolutely hold that thought about being interested in the conversation, because it's going to be a good one, I'm sure. Our next speaker is Tim Bevan, who's head of standards operations at Sintali, which is a UK-based leader in the development of sustainability standards. Tim started his career in 2000 at PRE's Centre for Sustainable Construction, where he worked on the development and operation of the BREEAM code for sustainable homes and the sequel standard. So big up Tim for that, and major kudos for that, because that's had a big effect on the construction sector. In 2021, Tim joined Building with Nature, and then in 2024, Building with Nature joined Sintali, where obviously Tim is now working. So Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Andy, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. So yeah, there are 2 points that I'd like to make really about nature and placemaking. And the first is, in the last 50 years, much of the wildlife-rich habitat we have in the UK has been lost or degraded, and our country is now, sadly, one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, this is a result of how we manage our land use change, pollution and climate change and agriculture. Essentially, it's a reflection of our modern way of life, and we've become acclimatized to this, and it influences how we perceive and define the natural world around us. And it's what academics and environmentalists call shifting baseline syndrome. So whilst it's nice to think we live in a green and pleasant land, and obviously in this country we do have a lot of natural wonders left still, it is a land where nature is under stress and not always managed for its benefit. So that's the first point. The second point is about placemaking. Our built environment does not always meet our collective health and social needs, and often we trade in natural functions, we trade in nature and land use issues and systems for what I think is a less effective placemaking reality. And this was really brought home to me a few years ago by 2 pieces of research. The first was a housing design audit for England, and that concluded that the design of new housing developments is overwhelmingly mediocre or poor, particularly with less affluent communities being worst affected. And a local architect involved in that study said of one of the developments he audited that the cumulative effect of all the design flaws and the isolation of the estate made it a miserable place to try and exist. I'll just pause on that. A miserable place to try and exist. This is a modern housing development. Another piece of research that I came across was New Economics Foundation that looked into neighbourhood green space provision, and they found that it had declined by 1/3 in 21st century developments. So if you're living in a neighbourhood built after the millennium, basically what this means is your local park is more likely to be smaller, and you're going to have to travel further to reach it. And that fact has resulted in, it's estimated 9 million fewer trips to green space every year. So often the way we collectively use land and design, construct and manage our built environment contributes to both nature's decline and the decline of people's mental and physical well-being. But it doesn't have to be that way, and I subscribe to the consensus that new development can be a catalyst for delivering biodiversity and public health gains rather than losses if we're prepared to embrace it. And that's really what I advocate and we advocate for through our work with Building with Nature and through the application of green infrastructure standards in new policy and development. And it's what we've been working with clients and users for since Building with Nature's inception, to really define and create a definition of good green infrastructure and help people meet that. So yeah, looking forward to today's session, and yeah, back to you, Andy.
Thanks very much, Tim, for that. Again, a lot for us to get our teeth into there, which we'll return to in the discussion. Next up, we have Andrew Gladstone-Heighton, who is the policy manager at the Association for Consultancy and Engineering, which is the business association that represents consultancy and engineering firms across the UK. I know that Andrew is a passionate advocate for regional development across the UK, and he's going to talk to us today, as I said earlier, about the ACE's Grey Spaces to Green Places publication that talks about and discusses and advocates for a climate resilient, nature-led approach to placemaking. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to be with you. Natural England, in their recent guidance around biodiversity net gain, identify 4 crises that we are facing in the UK. Previous colleagues on this panel have mentioned those. They are biodiversity, climate change, mental health, and housing. I would like to add a 5th crisis to that, which is the regional inequality, which is kind of a golden thread that runs through all those. What if I was to say to you, we have a golden opportunity to address all of those crises through a more creative and inclusive approach to placemaking? So that's essentially what I'm here for today. I have the privilege of working with consulting engineers across the UK and environmental excellence sector who've provided insight into how to create greener, better places to live across the UK. Myself, I come from the northeast of England, very proud of where I live, an area of mixed fortunes and mixed history. We took the carbon out of the ground through mining. Perhaps it's our responsibility, therefore, to return that carbon to the ground. I also come from local government, so I have experience of working across several domains and several areas. I'm also, in my role, an enthusiastic amateur. I work with experts in the built environment, and as a synthesist, I bring their ideas together across domains to try and produce a solution. So what is Grey Spaces to Green Places? It's essentially building better built, nicer places to live, which we all want. And other panelists have touched upon how the messaging of that sometimes gets confused. So we really need to build climate resilient places for the future, but we need to make them climate resilient, not in a climate fortress way, sea walls, concrete. We've seen too much of that solution. We also need connected solutions. We also need nature positive solutions, perhaps more leaning towards the solar punk trend, but the reality will lie somewhere in the middle. Luckily for us, it turns out that nature-based solutions generally tend to be cheaper, more inclusive, and address those crises as well. So I look forward to discussing our members' findings and your questions on the panel. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks very much, Andrew. The final speaker in this session is Josh Matthews, who's an independent activist, analyst, and founder of CMAS, which is Critical Mass for Sustainability. And also, it would be remiss of me not to mention that Josh was a parliamentary candidate in the recent general election for Lewisham West and East Dulwich, and I think he's the first parliamentary candidate that we've had as a panelist during the course of this Net Zero week. The fact that he's here and not in Parliament might actually tell you the result of that, but I know that won't diminish his enthusiasm for the subject under discussion for us this morning. So, Josh, over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Andy. Yeah, you beat me to it. I think in another universe, I might have been pretty busy this morning, but not to be. But I think the other sort of useful political bit of background is spent a bit of time as a city councillor up in Cambridge. So Robin, your mentioning of the dynamics of sustainability and the low traffic neighborhoods, 15-minute cities in Oxfordshire, reasonably aware of and have nothing but sympathy. But I think there have been some pretty good signs so far since the election. I think there's been a welcome level of ambition, especially when it comes to local government and devolution. But I think a lot of us are working on the assumption that local government isn't really going to get a massive funding boost over the coming years, and I think we'll probably all agree that it needs to play a massive role in tackling the climate, broader sustainability emergency, so on all the kind of environmental, social, the economic side. But so for me, critical mass started off because we're clearly not moving at the speed and the systems level that sustainability needs, whether it's business, whether it's consumer behavior, whether it's politics. And the question in my mind then, and kind of still is what is the proverbial critical mass that can pull policymaking, people, and all kind of business sectors into alignment, whether it's the Paris Agreement or the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Kind of what does that critical mass look like, and how do you convene it? And increasingly, I'm focusing on the idea that potentially that critical mass is whatever proves so unequivocally that sustainability works on all of those environmental, social, and economic fronts. So trying to, I suppose, remove the small p politics out of it and showing that sustainability works for everyone and everywhere. So lots for us to discuss today. I think one thing I'll throw into the mix is whether groups of local governments potentially who have a particular expertise or a head start in one area, whether that's putting together full integrated sustainability roadmaps, or whether it's a more specific area like greening urban spaces, could combine together to form kind of tiny little pockets of critical mass that approve, lay out the templates for other local governments to replicate in their own context. So across, basically you say everything comes under sustainability, but also any area for a local government to address housing, social care, education, it can all come under that approach. So yeah, hoping to pick up plenty of ideas from you all today.
Thanks very much, Josh. We're going to dive into the questions straight away because time is limited and we've got the four of you on the panel here. I'm going to go back to Robin. And I think hopefully what we're trying to do here is to get people to act differently, to think differently, to behave differently. And that's not just the people who are affected, that's the people who are making the decisions as well. So crucially, how do we get people and politicians on side with all of this?
I mean, that's a really good question and the ultimate one. I think that there are some people who will be persuaded by evidence. A lot react to stories and demonstrations. I think, to some extent, Oxford is leading the way in the traffic change sphere, which is going to be a big one because it's a large portion of emissions. And so what happens in Oxford over the next 6 months, 12 months will be very important. A lot of changes happening in London, of course, and showing that that can work will be a signal for other local authorities as to whether it can happen. I mean, we know we need to do this just for traffic reasons, let alone environmental reasons. I think inevitably 10% of people will not like it, and 10% of those will make angry protests and cause trouble. So the ability to work through that and demonstrate something successful will be a signal for the rest of the country, and it's going to have to be done.
Okay, thanks, Robin. Just turning to Tim. One of the things that comes out with all of this, I think, is I mean, Robin just mentioned evidence there. What is the evidence for the health-related benefits of green infrastructure? Are we doing enough to promote that in order to persuade hearts and minds? And I'll come on to the political aspect of this a little bit later, because in my view, the politicians do actually need to do something different as well. But anyway, Tim, just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, there's growing evidence that green infrastructure, for example, improves the physical and mental health of urban populations. And there was a review of the evidence by University College London back in 2018, and they found things like access to urban green infrastructure increases physical activity, it decreases heart rate and mortality, and there have been numerous studies that have found increasing urban green space, for example, had a protective effect from diseases such as coronary heart disease, asthma, diabetes, and also that it helps improve attention, reduces psychological distress, and reduction in violence in some cases, and that's primarily as a result of better social cohesion promoted by access to things like good green infrastructure. I think the current evidence doesn't necessarily demonstrate the direct mechanisms that underline those associations between urban green space and human health. So maybe if there's someone listening who's after a kind of a research topic, that would be one area to look into. Yeah, I mean, what is it about being in nature or green spaces that triggers these benefits? I think that's something that we need to do more of and show the benefits of. But perhaps it's more simply that as a species, we're just not designed to live in the cities we've created. So we need to look at, you know, the cities we've created and the types of spaces that people need and that benefit from, because you know, a lot of the health indicators are showing that there are impacts from our you know, our buildings, and there's been a lot of good research by the Building Research Establishment around the cost of poor quality housing and the impact of that on things like the NHS. So if we can divert some of the money we're spending in treating the symptoms into addressing some of the causes, then it has huge potential to not only improve our health, but actually get much more bang for our buck, both in terms of better housing quality and better green spaces and green infrastructure, which obviously then has a knock-on benefit to the natural world as well.
Thanks, Tim. Just turning to Andrew. I mean, obviously, we hear a lot, and we heard a lot of talk about the financially challenged environment that we're currently in during the course of the general election campaign. Obviously, what we're talking about here is a completely different approach to, in many ways, or having a different approach to, you know, to placemaking. And when you talk about something different, people get a bit nervous about money. In your view, how can we persuade those who are in charge of developing this area of policy, ultimately spending the money both nationally and locally, that this is a viable approach and one that will actually pay dividends in the future?
Thank you very much. I think two strands to this. Firstly, the previous speakers have touched on this in terms of the savings from other domains. So perhaps, you know, the hypothecated savings that will be gathered from a greener space on the social care budget, for example. Councils are very constrained on their social care spending. So if it can be proven that there is a link that a better place will a better built, greener space will reduce the burden on the social care sector, so be it. Similarly with health. I think also there's encouraging signs, having seen the manifestos published before the election and the result of the election. We're seeing very much the language evolving around the disruption due to climate change and climate resilience. So I would ask, what's the opportunity cost of not building climate resilient places? Because it's going to be much more expensive to mop up afterwards and rebuild rather than actually have a sensible approach to climate resilience. Also, looking further forward, I know insurance companies have done a lot of work looking into future premium costs in terms of climate resilience and climate related disruption. So if it can be proven that building in climate resilience can help reduce those premiums in the future, then it is a cheaper place to run and live in. And finally, I would also just say as well, if you can make a material impact on people's lives in a place, then that place will thrive. If you can use groundwater heating to cut their heating bills, for example, or show that, provision of third spaces, which will allow young people to have a space outside of work and home where they can go and socialize and not gather on the streets, that in itself creates a buzz around a place, which will not only create a sense of well-being, but economic prosperity too. So I think there really is a more positive argument here for saying, well, what's the opportunity? What's the cost of doing nothing? What's the cost of continuing as we are? Because ultimately, in the long term, that's only going to exacerbate those four crises.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for that comment. I'm going to return to some of those issues in a minute, but just kind of continuing the sort of political theme a little bit. I was interested in what Tim was talking about early on when he mentioned some of the reports that have been done into well-being, sustainability, and he name-checked he name-checked the new economics foundation, and I'm looking down the list of newly elected MPs, and one name stuck out at me, and that's Miata Fanbulla, who is used to be the chief executive of the NEF, the New Economics Foundation, and she's now an under minister in Ed Miliband's climate change department. So I think, and if you actually look a bit wider than that, there are all sorts of new people who've gone into Parliament who have a background in the sort of issues that we're discussing today, albeit in think tanks and other advisory roles. But it'll be interesting to see whether or not their think tankery actually translates into actually positive action going forward. So that's a kind of a long-winded introduction to a question to Josh, which is, will the recent election result change anything? And how do we keep the pressure on politicians, particularly those who should be more receptive to this issue than maybe what we've seen previously?
Yeah, so the answer is I hope so. And I think, like I said in my introduction, I think I'm encouraged by the level of ambition and the clarity that came out or has come out in the past week. I think naturally quite a cautious election strategy, but it's nice to see actually now that the election has been and gone, that it does seem that there is some ambition, not just on the climate and sustainability front, but the right words and the right meetings are taking place when it comes to devolution. I think the group of regional mayors was in Downing Street a few days ago. So I mean, devolution is an obvious one, but that again has to come with the funding settlements, right? I think a commitment to long-term funding settlements was in the Labour manifesto, is my understanding. It was in ours. You mentioned that there's a Liberal Democrat, right? So devolution being certainly one of our wheelhouses, but it's good to see a more kind of consistent agreement that is the way forward. But yeah, that devolution and the funding has to come together, because otherwise it's more and more responsibility for local government with less and less money. I think an interesting one, I'm sure some of you might have been involved with it at times, is the LGA, the Local Government Association, to really empower that group to what I mentioned at the start, to share the best practices and what works, whether it's on the strategic side or with technology, joint procurement initiatives, could be anything. Planning reform might be the major change that we see, and there's all sorts of tie-ins to to Labour's plans for GB Energy, and they need to be fleshed out. But what I've seen so far is at least encouraging. And the last point I'll make, one thing that I didn't realise until quite recently was that 3 billion of the 8 billion that they've committed to GB Energy to get some of these projects kickstarted is specifically for local government, with the other 5 billion being for kind of bigger supply chains and bigger projects. So I hope that comes through pretty soon.
Thanks, Josh. What I'm really interested in all of this, because obviously there's a lot of stuff talked about cost, there's a lot of stuff talked about priorities, but what about how we frame this issue, and how do we highlight its importance? Because successive polls would say, well, this is a really vital issue, particularly amongst younger people. Yes, we're concerned about the environment. Yes, we want to achieve net zero. But are we coming at this issue from the right direction? Are we framing it correctly? Uh, and the reason I ask that is that, as I say, a lot of talk about finances and priorities, but surely it's about, we would probably around this table agree it's a no-brainer. We need to do it. But how do we frame the issue in such a way that people think, yeah, I get that, it has to be done? And therein you have, I suppose, the beginnings of a persuasive approach to government and other opinion formers. I mean, I don't know what you think on that, Robin, given the fact that you're in amongst it, with specific challenges that you face in Oxford. You've had to deal with public opinion, and you mentioned some of the groups that came together on both sides of the argument. So framing the argument, is there something in that that basically can help us get to success?
It's essentially important, Andy, and I think there's two aspects that we're thinking of. One is you've got to think about what connects with people, and kind of you've got to drive less is not a good way of connecting it, and of course a lot of people need to drive for a lot of reasons. And that's not the main message. So there are two things. One is that so there are some issues about one way of connecting is about road safety, and that we're making safer places, and that is one very powerful way of connecting. And the other is that we want to make better places for people to live in. And if I just connect that to what Tim and Andrew were talking about, one of the things, if we are designing places with more green space built in, with better houses, with more, I'd add more walkable places that are better designed, so the kind of layout and the connectivity is better, and you don't have to use your car so much. People want to live there, and actually this is good for the house builders as well, because people pay more for those houses as well. So it's a win all round. Yeah, and the street conversions that have been done, the low traffic neighbourhoods. I mean, initially you've got people who are sceptical, but then they decide, oh, actually, it's quite nice not to have several thousand cars coming down my street all day, even if it's slightly more inconvenient for me.
Thanks, Robin. Just turning to Tim. I mean, again, continuing that kind of framing conversation, how do we highlight that development can benefit both people and nature? Because it clearly can, as we've heard from a number of our speakers already. So how do we get that message across when maybe from some people, Tim, they would say that it's incompatible?
Yeah, I think I was just thinking as Robin was talking. I mean, I think maybe COVID changed the field a little bit, and we often talk about green infrastructure, which is obviously quite in some senses a sort of technical term, and maybe not that friendly. But we talk about green infrastructure as being critical infrastructure, and I think when it comes to a lot of standard development, what goes around our buildings is sometimes treated more as a garnish, a bit like when you get your fancy meal with a bit of green sprinkled on top, and what we're talking about is much more fundamental than that, and I think trying to communicate that to people, you wouldn't buy a house that didn't have electricity and running water. That is critical infrastructure. And I think green spaces, low traffic neighbourhoods, making people front and centre of new development and existing developments, of course, is vital. So let's not completely design new developments around the car. Cars are important; they need to be factored in. But too often we give over our sort of spaces to roads, to wheelie bin storage. There's lots of tarmac. So I think trying to build on what people experienced during COVID, the importance of access to green space, and highlighting that this is critical infrastructure for a number of reasons, and it's not just about protecting and looking after nature, which a lot of people don't necessarily have a connect with. It is about people as well, and placemaking, and that then obviously, as I said earlier, starts to then have benefits in terms of using development to support more strategic goals around things like nature recovery strategies, and using things like biodiversity net gain to sort of connect developments back into the landscapes which they're situated within. So I think viewing green infrastructure and viewing what we're talking about as being critical infrastructure, and trying to get across that narrative will hopefully try and get people, whether that's a homeowner or a planning officer or whatever, to ask the right questions when they're either reviewing new proposals, or you're a designer, or you're a homeowner looking to buy a new home. We look for certain things, don't we, when we're looking for a home. Location is obviously key, but we want our en-suites, we want our garages, we want our gardens, but let's start asking and getting people to ask the questions about the broader critical green infrastructure as well.
Thanks, Tim. Kind of flowing from that to Andrew, your report, Green Spaces to Green Places, very much advocates for a community-led approach. What are the challenges of going down that route? And also, from your report's point of view, what kind of response are you getting to what you're talking about? And is there any kind of concept from some of the opinion formers that, well, that's all well and good, but how are we going to pay for it?
Very good question. I think there's a broader, to zoom out a little bit, there is has been a feeling, especially in left behind places around the UK, of a sense of isolation and distance from the core. They very much feel on the periphery in terms of funding and decision making. So I think for placemaking, it's essential to get that community buy-in. As Robin has identified, you're always going to get a 10% who are against things. But I think that early engagement, and that importance of local decision making, and giving local authorities, regional authorities, the spending to be able to do that and to tie the benefits together. So, for example, areas and regions where the transport links have been devolved or taken on by regional authorities allows for a more joined up approach for bus routes, for example, near large new housing developments, which will hopefully lead to less car usage. So by drawing those things together and clearly communicating them to the constituents, hopefully that shows a sense of place and a sense of purpose within a place. I also think as well, a lot of our members engage in what's the blanket term social value is thrown around. I like the term community benefit rather than social value. Major infrastructure projects have additional value beyond the project itself. Part of that social value can be working with local charities, local people, food banks, litter picking, working with young offenders in the area to bring them on board and on side for the project, not only to show the value that the individual project is making, that one of our members or clients is building, but also to build that, lift the chin of opportunity in that area, and show that building a more nature first, climate friendly response, or a piece of climate resilient infrastructure creates those high skilled, high wage jobs and those opportunities within that area. those young people then go home to their families and rave about the benefits of a nature first solution or building a natural floodplain, and therefore you bring people along on the ride. Also, I think zooming out again more broadly, the move to a more value-based procurement. So rather than the most financially viable tender getting through, but a more holistic plan will hopefully include a lot of this community benefit baked in and a lot of this pre-engagement, which will hopefully speak to constituents and their concerns so that they are bought in for the project. And when the conversation then moves on to price, you can see, yes, it may cost more. However, here are the peripheral benefits. And if we have metrics around potential GVA growth of an area, or benefits of savings through community spaces, or the inclusion of community spaces, multi-faith prayer rooms available for groups to use, and bringing those groups on board. I think it's just that early engagement and that real focus on community and co-design, which speaks to a place feeling less behind and more involved at the outset.
Thanks, Andrew. Just turning to Josh, local government's obviously going to be absolutely critical in a lot of what we're talking about here, because they're at the coalface, they're involved in delivering, they're involved in overseeing a lot of local development, and absolutely rightly so. Couple of questions for you. How can we better empower local governments in areas like planning, funding, strategy, everything really? And also, how can we, maybe this is a bit more political, how can local government avoid sustainability being weaponized politically? Maybe it's unavoidable. Maybe we can't take the politics out of it. So the first one, how do we empower local government collectively on a wider scale? And how do we deal with the the issue and I suppose the politics of it?
Yeah. So on the first bit, kind of beyond what's come up quite a lot in the conversation around devolution, the long-term funding settlements, I mentioned empowering the local government association to share kind of strategy, technology, all manner of best practices. But Andrew, what you mentioned, I could not be a bigger advocate for early engagement with communities. I saw it firsthand in Cambridge that if you include the key local people, community groups, as early as possible in a development, whether it's housing, whether it's energy infrastructure, whatever it might be, you remove that feeling that something's being imposed on them, that the plan has, like has so often happened, the plan is completely designed and then it's sent out for consultation, where there's almost no room for change. I mean, I think people genuinely realize that they can't design new infrastructure or housing developments completely themselves, and there will be things that they wish weren't there. But people feel engaged and they feel that they've had their contributions heard, and that is so much easier right at the start. And it makes life so much easier for the developers as well, because I can't imagine it being a fun place to have that many people angry at you when you just come up with something completely devoid of any consultation and just be sort of thrown to people at the last minute. Also helps local councillors as well. Like, we like to bring people together, like to try and sort of arbitrate those really healthy, positive conversations. But yeah, there are better ways to do that. So onto the bit about the politics of the whole thing. It will be weaponized, but we can do a better job at either being prepared or having just the arguments kind of ready to go, but almost removing as much of the opportunity for climate and sustainability to be weaponized as possible. I think the principle is sort of showing, not just people have mentioned it, showing that sustainability in a broad sense works on the environmental front, but it also works on the social, it works for people, and it works on the economic front. So trying to shift the conversation, the understanding that it does work or should work for everyone everywhere. I think a key bit of that, it's probably going to sound obvious, but the subtleties I think get lost sometimes, is making sure the incentives are there for everyone to change and align themselves with various sustainability goals. But to make sure that whether it's the tariffs, whether it's carbon tax, whether any kind of disincentives are only there, especially right now, for the people who can afford it. And that is where so many initiatives fall down, because the costs are just fully borne by the least well-off, by the least advantaged. I think the main point where that comes through is in the upfront capital investment, because I think there's general consensus, both kind of qualitatively and very sort of on a quantified basis, that in the long term sustainability, whether it's efficiency, whether it's health, whether it's a number of areas, will benefit absolutely everybody on all fronts. But there is a capital cost to that. There is an upfront investment, and we have to, and it's a combination between politicians, between the experts, whether academia, business, developers, whoever it might be, to make sure that that upfront hurdle is not borne by the people who can't afford it, and that is what will invariably lead to the opposition.
Thanks, Josh. Just going back to Robin, I mean, you've been through. Sorry, go on. You were going to make a point.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Josh has said, because there's a huge opportunity here, because I mean, if Labour gets anywhere close to their 1.5 million houses plan, and the key here is to you need to get into the developments at a very early stage. And we've been talking to our local authority about the pre-application stage before the master plan gets set. And that is the time where you've got to build in sustainable transport connectivity, you've got to build in the green infrastructure or the nature, the green spaces that you want. And there are definitely some developers who are starting to get it and be more accepting and more consultative in that pre-application stage, and they really see the benefits, because when they come to the more formal stages, they see less objections to their plans, because they are better plans, because they've already talked to the council more. Sometimes they've even gone out to stakeholders and done a bit of informal consultation and input taking from the local community. Whereas the ones who go for the traditional route of kind of behind closed doors pre-application, come up with their own plans, sometimes meet with a lot of objection. It's an interesting change.
Okay, I'm going to address a final question to all of you, because I don't know about you, but and maybe it's just because I'm by nature one of life's optimists, but I am actually optimistic about a lot of the stuff in this area, particularly when we focus on, the need for a sense of place and all of the issues that you guys have been talking about. And I'm optimistic, partly based on the framing work that's been going on in other areas of policy, even over the last 5 days, really. So, are you optimistic about the future? And do you think that we are going to basically achieve what we need to achieve on this area of how do we create better urban landscapes and, if you like, green our environment in the right way? And I'm going to start with Tim on that. And if you can be brief, because we've literally got a
Yeah,
few
sure.
minutes.
Yeah, I am optimistic. I'm always a glass half full type of person. I think most people, whether they're planners, designers, house builders, they don't want to create well, they want to create good places, and we're involved at the forefront of that. So when I think it was Robin was talking about getting in early, that's something we advocate, and we obviously develop standards in the green infrastructure space, and our advice is always to apply them early and to engage with the community, and we've even got that as requirements within our standards. And I see examples of developers, and ranging from lauded landowners to traditional house builders that are starting to take on board this and really sort of appreciate more their responsibility in that respect. So that does give me hope, and obviously with the Labour's announcement around 1.5 million homes, it's good to see that they're also talking about the quality of those as well, and that will be a challenge, I think, which we're going to have to face. But we've been through this before, and we've used standards to drive up quality in the past. Unfortunately, some of them, you mentioned the Code for Sustainable Homes, that was lost, but that's a good example of where standards can drive up good quality. And so I think if we're getting back into that space and everyone's on board with that, then yeah, I'm optimistic.
Great. Andrew, reasons for optimism. Briefly.
Increasing recognition that we're all facing the same challenges. The homeowner who loses their house on the East Coast due to coastal erosion shares the same root cause of their problems as the business owner who was flooded out, as the commuter whose journey is disrupted due to extreme heat distorting the rails. I think there is an increasing understanding that there is a common root cause and common solutions to these issues. And I remain optimistic that both our decision makers and the electorate will hold people to account to create beautiful places that are fit for the future.
Thanks, Andrew. Josh?
Yes, optimism, because the alternative is unthinkable. But we can't let that optimization, not optimization, that's the wrong word, optimism, cloud the fact that we are monumentally in trouble on a lot of sustainability fronts, and we need an outrageous amount of national ambition. But that ambition has to break down and connect, and we mentioned it to that community level development, and get the whole piece working together, because otherwise, we don't have time to talk through, but I think we all know what could happen.
Thanks, Josh. Finally, Robin, reasons to be cheerful.
Yes, well, we just had an event at the Earth Trust, which is a huge green space in Oxfordshire, and one of our volunteers described she had her mental health issues really improved by engaging with the green spaces. She described herself as a stubborn optimist, and I will adopt that. And we've got a huge opportunity now. Labour are reviewing the National Planning Policy Framework. There's huge evidence that supports nature, it supports active travel. Now's the time to start building it in, and I think the next 10 years are going to be really pivotal in making that change.
Marvellous. Thanks very much indeed. We've run out of time, but thanks for the optimistic tone that you've struck at the end of this discussion. Thanks to all of our panellists, to Robin, to Andrew, to Josh, and to Tim. Thanks very much indeed, and thanks to everybody for watching and listening. Join us again at 11 a.m. when we have a very interesting keynote discussion chat around the financing of the whole sustainability net zero area. But for now, it's me, Andy Walker, saying thanks very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.